introducing people. So if people missed that, they wouldn't have missed too much. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dion Filmer. I'm the director of the World Bank's Development Research Group. So welcome to this February edition of our Policy Research Talks. This is our first of 2022. These talks give us an opportunity to present our work coming out of the research department here at the bank, with the goal of sharing findings with colleagues inside and outside the department, along with others outside the World Bank. So welcome to all of our online audience, both on WebEx as well as on YouTube. Our presenter today is my colleague Sandra Rosso, who's a research economist in the Poverty and Inequality team in the department. She joined the department last June after working for 5 years as an assistant professor of economics at the Marshall School of Business of the University of Southern California. She's currently, she's a IZA research fellow, a SIGA faculty affiliate, a faculty member of the Schaefer Center for Health and Economics Policy, and a research fellow at the Center for Economic and Social Research at the University of Southern California. So well connected. Today, Sandra will present her research on the impacts of migrant regularization programs on the life of refugees. She'll be talking about a specific case of a large regularization program that offered approximately 500,000 Venezuelan refugees the opportunity to regularize their migration status in Colombia. We're extremely grateful to have Felipe Munoz as a discussant today. Since August 2020, Mr. Munoz has served as the head of the migration unit of the Inter-American Development Bank. Previously, he was a presidential advisor for the border between Colombia and Venezuela, where he coordinated the Colombian government response to the migratory flow from Venezuela at the national and local levels, as well as the related efforts of other stakeholders, civil society organizations, and international actors. He's intimately familiar with being one of the overseers of the program that we're going to be discussing today. So the run of show today is going to be Sandra will talk for approximately 45 minutes, after which we'll hear from Felipe for between 10 and 15 minutes. We'll conclude the session with a Q&A from the audience. If you have a question, please use the raised hand option in WebEx, or just signal in the chat that you have a question and I'll call on you and ask you to say it out loud. If you're following on YouTube, please submit your question in the chat and that will get relayed to me. Just a reminder, we're recording the session today. And also, please, could you mute your microphone if you're not talking? With that, over to you, Sandra.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, can you hear me and see the slides well? Super. Thank you very much for the nice introduction, for all of you, for the interest in our work, and Felipe, of course, for being here and commenting on our paper. So this is going to be joint work with Ana Maria Ibañez, Andrés Moya, Maria Ortega, and Maria Urbina. And as Dion mentioned, what we're going to do in a nutshell is evaluate the impacts or show you the results of this evaluation of a very large amnesty that the Colombian government offered to Venezuelan refugees in 2018. So here is a broad outline of how I structure our talk for today so that you know where we are at while I'm talking. And let me begin by motivating the topic so that you know why you should care about this or why it is relevant. So I wanted to mention two facts. So one of them is that the vast majority of refugees is actually in the world hosted in developing countries. So here in this table, you see the top 20 hosts of refugees in the world, according to UNHCR data, last updated in June 2021. And if you look at the countries that are listed here, you would see that of those, the vast majority of them, only 3 of them are countries of the global north. And all of the rest, the 17 remaining, are countries of the global south. So the second place is actually occupied by Colombia, who's hosting approximately 2 million people, 2 million Venezuelan refugees. So first important idea that I want you to grasp from this is that refugees are predominantly hosted in the global south. And then developing countries have shown a very large heterogeneity, a very large spectrum of responses in terms of how do we allow these refugees to integrate to labor markets. So there are countries that have opted to be more restrictive, like, for example, Bangladesh, in which refugees are in refugee camps and they are not allowed to work outside of the camps. There are countries that have a more intermediate approach, like Peru, Turkey, Jordan, in which they have partial access to certain sectors, or if they have a sponsor from a firm, or there are quotas, and firms are only allowed to hire a certain amount of foreigners. And Colombia, with countries like Uganda in Africa, are more liberal. They are the most liberal, I think, that I have known of. And so here, refugees have free mobility, and they have a right to be part of the labor market. So what we're going to be talking about today is how do these amnesties impact refugees in this country. So to give you a snapshot of what has been done, what we know about the evolution of refugees and how they affect hosting communities, I prepared this slide in which I wanted to kind of give you an overview of the latest papers. So I would say there was a dramatic spark on research on forced displacement in maybe the last 10 years. And the vast majority of them have been focused on the impacts of forced displacement within host economies. So how are natives affected, their education system, their health system, their voting behaviors, their labor markets. Of course, that has been the core of research. But there is a lot less evidence on how do we effectively support refugees and hosting nations in making these refugees self-reliant? So there is one exception, which are cash transfers. So for the Middle East, Onur Altindag and Stephen O'Connell for the case of Lebanon, and Berg Osler, who's here, and co-authors have evaluated the impacts that cash transfer has had in Turkey for refugees. But there is negligible evidence on policies that can promote self-reliance, in which we're actually giving a more development approach to refugees for them to create their own income. And so this is where we're going to kind of be complementing the literature. So let me be more precise in what is our question and our contribution. So the research question that we're going to ask is how this very large amnesty, the PEP, Permiso Especial de Permanencia, impacted refugees, their life outcomes. But we're not only going to focus on labor markets outcomes, as it has been the focus of the literature, but we're going to try to explore other dimensions, like their income, their consumption, their health, not only physical, but mental as well, the access to state services, and importantly, how do they feel in the Colombian society? This is a very important, let's say, question, because many of these refugees might never leave. So of course, how they feel will respond to how they decide to invest, or for example, not only invest in assets, but also invest in their human capital in Colombia. So this program, importantly, seeks to empower refugees to promote their self-reliance. And I think that's what is very different from other programs that have been studied. And this is a very much development-based approach. We're trying to endow the vulnerable population with instruments for them to get out of their vulnerability status. So in terms of amnesties, what do we know? So the existing evidence has been focused on partial programs. And when I say partial programs, I mean those programs that evaluated, for example, that were available for people who had a passport, or who had higher education, or who worked in certain sectors only. It was also focused on developed countries in the global north. But you can imagine how let's say, the dynamics of the impacts of refugees are very different in the global south. Why? There is very large informal sectors in the global south. And so you can imagine how a refugee might not have incentives to jump to the formal sector. They are already working, and they might think it doesn't make sense for me to pay taxes. So it's not necessarily obvious that they are going to take this amnesty. So the results might not translate let's say, in a direct way from the global north to the global south. And it has been mostly focused on native communities. What happens when you regularize people with the people who are living, the natives, but not on refugees per se? So specifically, this paper was, let's say, motivated by a paper that we wrote earlier with Nani Bahar and Ana Maria Ibanez, in which we exactly did that. We evaluated how this regularization program impacted labor outcomes for Colombian workers. And we were very surprised, to be frank with you, by the results, because we found there was approximately 500,000 people who were offered the possibility of having a formal job, a job permit, and there were negligible impacts, precisely zero estimated impacts for Colombian workers. So we started to think, what is going on? Is it that they are not taking up this program? what is happening with these refugees, and we decided we wanted to do a more comprehensive study to actually interview these refugees and see how this program was impacting their life outcomes. What is different about this program? It is a large-scale and sudden regularization. Nobody knew this was going to happen. There were no eligibility criteria, other than, of course, being able to show they were Venezuelan. It is going to take place in a country in the global south, where informality is high, which is, as I have tried to point it out several times today, the majority of countries are actually these type of countries. Most of the refugees are hosted in the global south. So this is not only relevant for Colombia, but for other countries that are also hosting refugees and might be deciding whether or not to implement these type of policies. And we're going to try to evaluate the impacts on a comprehensive set of life outcomes. Okay, so with that, let me talk a little bit about the details of the program. So the PEP program, as I said, is the Permiso Especial de Permanencia, and it was implemented in Colombia. So to tell you a little bit about the context, so presumably for many of you, this is not necessary, but I imagine there are people from other regions of the world that are here too, and so it is important for me to kind of bring everyone to the context. So the Venezuelan crisis has spiked in 2016. It has been a crisis for several years now. But in Colombia, the inflows of Venezuelan refugees started to really be important in 2016. And so in this map that you see on your right, you can see darker colors for those countries who are hosting more Venezuelan refugees. This is according to an UNHCR data. And actually, Colombia is the one that is hosting currently the most important number of Venezuelan refugees. And this is, of course, an understatement of the amount of people, because there is a lot of people that might not be registered with the UNHCR office. So according to data by June 2021, there were approximately 4 million people who had fled Venezuela because of the humanitarian, political, and social crisis. And Colombia was hosting approximately 1.7 million people. So the Colombian government, of course, has been very generous, as I mentioned earlier. And in 2018, they decided to try to count how many people were irregular or had an irregular status in Colombia. What does it mean to be irregular? Irregular means that you do not have a proper migration or migratory status in the country. Basically, you have not stamped a passport, or you don't have the authorization from the Colombian government to be in the country. In many places, or in many instances, sometimes these type of migrants are called illegal migrants, but I don't think that's a correct term. So I would refer to them as irregular migrants. So what the government tried to do in 2018 was count how many people were in this regular status in Colombia. So they opened the census, it was called the RAM, the Registro Administrativo de Migrantes Venezolanos, and people will voluntarily come and register as irregular migrants. It was not advertised as a program in the sense that they will receive anything for registering, and this is an important part of our evaluation. And it was advertised with media, with local organizations of Venezuelan refugees, with local stores, and it was collected in approximately 441 municipalities in Colombia. Colombia has approximately 1,200 municipalities. So approximately 500,000 people registered for this census, and it closed in June 8th of 2018. So this is important because this is going to be a date that we're going to use to evaluate the impacts of this program. So I will explain the details later. And so later on, the government who was in office, the president, decided that in July, after this closed, he was going to regularize the people who were in the census. This happened after this was collected. And he opened the PEP program for anyone who was registered in the RAM census. The PEP actually existed before, and it was available to Venezuelan refugees who met certain criteria, like they had a passport or they have a sponsor. But this was the first time that the government opened this very large-scale regularization for people who are more vulnerable, who did not have the proper migratory status in Colombia. It was available between August 2nd and December 21st of 2018. And interestingly, of the 500,000 people approximately that were eligible to this program, only 60% registered. It was a very generous amnesty. So I'm talking about not only having the legal migratory status, but having a work permit, having access to health education system and childcare services. So with this permit, they will be able to register at the CISBEN. CISBEN is a proxy means test used to target safety nets in Colombia. So with this permit, they could go and register to actually be ranked and see if they could access these safety net programs in Colombia. And they could also access any like say bank account or financial services. So this was an important change for them. What was surprising to us is that only 60% of them actually decided to apply. It didn't seem like there was anything they could lose. Okay, so how do we design our study? So this is the beginning when we decided to do this study of the Venezuelan Refugee Panel Survey. We call it VenReps. And what we're doing with this survey is that we plan to follow a representative sample of people who are eligible and not eligible for this program in time to evaluate how their life is changing because of this program. So we have collected the first wave of this survey, and this is the one that I will be presenting to you today. So the issue was we want to collect a representative survey of people who are, let's say, eligible, that were treated by this program, and people who are ineligible. But this, of course, is not a random experiment. It's not like they said, let's just run a lottery and you can have a permit and you're not going to have it. So it's not as easy to evaluate this program. But bear with me and let me explain to you how we did the sample collection. So it was very easy to actually get data for the eligible migrants, in large part thanks to Felipe, who is here because he was at the time coordinating the program in Colombia. And so he facilitated that we were able to access the data, the contact data of everyone who was eligible and who was in that census. So we basically just constructed a random sample and were able to get a representative sample of the eligible migrants. The challenge was the ineligible ones. So how do you find people who are, let's say, distrustful of the government and have an irregular status? And how do you do it on the phone because COVID arrived? So it has been the most challenging data collection that I have ever done, because you can imagine when you call someone, hello, are you an irregular migrant? People will immediately hang up. So we had to kind of become very resourceful as to how do we create trust. So at the end, how do we collect the samples for the ineligible migrants was from referrals from refugees. Any refugee that we came across, we actually asked for a referral in a similar to a snowballing sampling, in which they would refer us to potential eligible persons to our study. But this was not only the way to construct the data, we also reached out to all the local organizations of Venezuelan refugees. We tell them about our program and they shared with us their beneficiary data. So from there, we were also kind of had a very large bag of people that we could randomly assign and construct a statistically significant representative population of ineligible migrants. At the end, who did we have in our sample? We had Venezuelan migrants, those who were born in Venezuela, who were adults in Colombia, 18 plus years of age, and who arrived between January 2017 and December of 2018. And so before we began our instrument and interviewing people, our instrument or the questionnaire construction, we decided to do a qualitative survey. And this is something that I would recommend to anyone who's trying to do any evaluation, a program evaluation, because it really enriched our views and changed a lot of the ideas that we had around the impacts of this program. So we had interviews with 42 individuals on Zoom. Again, this was in the middle of the pandemic. And we interviewed people who were irregular, people who were in the census and applied for the permit, and people who were in the census and did not apply for the permit. And what did we want to do with this? We wanted to understand who was in each situation, what were the motivations behind applying or not applying, and most importantly, how did this permit change their lives, or how do they view not having it will affect their lives? So this was very, very enriching for our study, and so we learned many things. I'm just going to talk about three, which I think were very important, change dramatically the design of our study. The first one is that there was very, very large mistrust and fear from Venezuelan refugees. They were afraid of being deported, basically, and so they were a little afraid of coming forward and applying to this program. So what a lot of them recommended is that they trusted tremendously their networks and their local organizations. So what we did because of that finding was that we contacted local migrant organizations and we told them about our project, what we wanted to do. And they helped us collect with all their beneficiaries, but also they told them about our study. And because they did that first contact and told them about what we were doing, when we actually reached out, they were more willing to respond to our survey. So that increased our response rates. The second one, which is surprising, is that people who had more networks in Colombia, meaning more friends, more family, actually applied less to the program, which was against our predictions. Basically, they felt as they didn't need this program. They already had an informal job. They had networks that would support them in finding another job. So they were not as interested in applying to this program. And the last one is that they told us, and it was also a surprising finding for us, that despite the fact that Venezuelans and Colombians speak Spanish, the language that was used oftentimes was difficult for them to understand. And that was surprising to us, again, because I am Colombian, so we most of the team was Colombian as well. So for us, talking to a Venezuelan was very easy. But it turned out maybe that for more vulnerable populations, we needed to do a better job at using their day-to-day language. So at the end, how do we collected our sample? Here is the map of Colombia divided by the 1,100 municipalities. And it was representative, we collected a sample that was representative of the 3 biggest urban centers, Bogotá, Barranquilla, and Medellin. This was where the program had the most number of beneficiaries. And it was also representative of other smaller cities, 9 of them, Cúcuta, Villa del Rosario, that also had a very high presence of refugees. The clean data had approximately 2,200 households, and of them, 1,100 were eligible and 1,100 roughly were ineligible for the program. Importantly, and this is something that I also would recommend to anyone doing this type of studies with populations that are hard to reach, we hired enumerators that were Venezuelan refugees themselves, and we trained them. And these increased our response rates like to the order of 15 to 20%, because I checked the data yesterday. So this was dramatically important for them to answer the phone and find someone talking to them that had their accent and that was also a migrant, really increased trust. And as I mentioned earlier, we had to modify the language that we used. So this is a funny anecdote. For Colombians, when we're trying to signal respect, we use the word usted, which signals a more, let's say, far away relationship or a more respectful relationship. But for Venezuelans, when you use that word, that's what they told us in the qualitative groups, it signals that you do not trust them. So when they are, like when you call them, they want to feel like you trust them. So you have to use a language that is more closer to them. And so we had to change all of our instruments, but it was a great finding that we got from the qualitative study. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about the descriptive analysis. So don't get scared about my tables. I promise I'm only going to talk about the red highlighted numbers here, but this is just to give you a flavor of what we have in the data. So column 1 is going to have the average of the people who were not in the census and not eligible for the program. And column 2 is going to have the people who were in the census and eligible for the program. So I only want to show you a few highlights. So one of them is that these populations are dramatically different. So for example, if we measure the time they have been in Colombia in terms of months, the people who are in the census, not surprisingly, have been almost 5 more months in Colombia, right? Let's talk about different demographics. Same columns, but let's now compare their years of education. So the people who have applied for the census have more years of education relative to the ones that are ineligible, okay? There are other differences, but I'm just kind of showing you some of them that I think are very important. And just one last difference I wanted to signal when we compare the number of, or if they had at all some friend or family before migrating, there is more networks concerning the ones who are not in the census, actually. So all of these things that I am showing you are just pointing to the fact that we cannot compare these populations and say, I'm going to evaluate the program and say, let's compare their means difference between both groups, because there are underlying differences in their socio-demographics that would ultimately probably show, oh, this program is fantastic. But it's not because of the program per se, but because, for example, the people who were eligible for the program were more time in Colombia, had more education, had more experience. And so we can confound our conclusions. So we need to actually use a different methodology. So before I show you the design or how do we actually evaluate this program, let me tell you a little bit of why people did not register for the census. So we asked the people who were ineligible, who were eligible but did not register, why? You were eligible for this program, why didn't you do that? Or why didn't you register for the census? And they all signaled that they didn't have information, a lot of them. So the most important share of people said, I didn't know about the census, and this is why I did not register. For the people that actually were in the census but did not apply for the job permit, same thing. They, for example, said, I did not have a passport, and these signals they did not have information because a passport was not a requirement. They did not need a passport to be a beneficiary of this program. Okay, so how do we, in practice, can distinguish the impacts of the program if these populations are so different? So I am going to explain this figure slowly, because if you understand this figure, then you have understood our study. So basically what I am showing you here is our survey, the population in our survey, the households in our survey. And as I told you, the people who are in our survey arrived to Colombia between January 1st of 2017 and December 31st in 2018. And that's shown on the horizontal axis. So basically in the horizontal axis, I'm showing you week by week the date of arrival of the households that are in our survey. And you can see the bars are going to show you the density, so the concentration of people that arrived in those weeks to Colombia. But the first thing to note is that there's no discontinuity on the gray bars. Like, it seemed like they were arriving all across these dates. And now let me talk about the blue line. So the blue line is going to show us the average number of households that actually applied for the program according to their date of arrival to Colombia, right? The way we interpret that is as the probability of applying for the program. So what is interesting about the blue line is that you can see that everyone who arrived before the census closed, the ramp closed, had a higher probability of applying, of actually applying to this program relative to the ones who arrived later, right? In fact, if everything had worked according to the rules, there should be no one who applied after the ramp closed. But there are sometimes special cases, and so but what is important is that we are able to see a discontinuity that is not explained by any demographics or any characteristics of the migrants on the probability of treatment. So it's like a perfect experiment. What we can do then is compare individuals who are close to this arrival date, but who had, because of that reason, a higher probability of applying before the census closed and a lower probability of arrived after the census closed, right? So we're going to compare those samples. Importantly, the differences on these populations are only driven by the difference in the probability of treatment and not by their education level or any other variables that we observe. And I am going to show you evidence of that. So this figure is basically the same one that I just showed you before. This figure here is a raw data. So this one is just showing you that there is actually statistical differences in the probability of applying to the program around the time in which the census closed. Okay, so one of the, let's say, risks when you use this type of methodologies, it's called the fuzzy regression discontinuity, RDD, is that we have to actually prove that there's not a discontinuity in other variables. There are not other things that are different between these groups. The only difference is the difference in the probability to apply to the program. So this is what this figure is doing. It is showing you that the difference between these groups that are close to this date in which the census closed are not significant across groups for those who arrive earlier and later. What are the types of things that we tested here? We actually asked them retrospective questions on all their labor characteristics and their household characteristics when they were in Venezuela and when they arrived to Colombia before the program was open, and we showed that there are not statistical difference in the vast majority of them. Okay, and this is very fast, don't worry about the equation. All this is basically, I am also going to show you in the results a means comparison between the people who are in the census and not in the census. I am going to control for some observables that I have collected, that's all. Why do we do this? Because we wanted to show you the results of different methodologies for robustness to show that they are actually robust, and also because when we do the OLS, this one, we can use the whole sample. And when we use the regression discontinuity, we have to focus only in the people who are close to the timing in which the survey, the RAM census closed. So the power or the precision or the sample size is smaller. Okay, so let me jump to the results. So before I actually show you the outcomes that we evaluated, I wanted to kind of walk you through how we thought about this. So this is not news to everyone. to anyone here, this is a very political sensitive topic, the impacts of refugees and giving them working job permits. So before we actually collected the data, we wanted to be very rigorous on what we were going to do. So we actually structured a pre-analysis plan. This is not something very common for evaluations that are non-experimental. This is not an experiment. This is just, we're exploiting a quasi-random variation, but this is not an experiment. But still, we wanted to be very, let's say, serious in the way we were going to carry this evaluation to be sure that nobody had any questions about, like, say, the transparency of our analysis. So we structure our analysis in 3 buckets. We thought, okay, the first thing we would like to see is what are the impacts of this program on the mechanical outcomes. Mechanical meaning what this program wanted to do: labor formalization, access to safety nets, access to financial services. And then the next question we had as a research team was, okay, once you have access to these services, what would you expect will change in the life of these refugees? And so there we thought, well, consumption, income. We wanted to see how their employment changed. We wanted to see how their mental and overall health changed. And that was what we called a primary outcome. And then we said, we can also have some exploratory outcomes like reservation wages, job satisfaction, food security, integration to the Colombian society, or COVID-19 resilience. But these are more exploratory. And these are not going to be, let's say, the focus of this study. We cannot test 100 outcomes in one paper, because statistically it would raise concerns. And so let me now tell you a little bit of what we found. I just want to put all the results in one slide so that you have an overview of what we found, and then I'll kind of walk you through each of these results. So the PEP improves the well-being of refugees, but it's not just a little bit, it's a dramatic change in their lives. So in terms of the mechanical outcomes, we observed that labor formalization increased in 10 percentage points. And originally, when we started disseminating this paper, we started saying, oh, this is a small effect, because of course, they had 0 formalization rates. And so we thought, how come you offer formalization to 500,000 people and there's only 10% of them who actually jump to the formal sector? And so originally, when we started presenting, we said, this is a small effect. But as we talk to experts and we actually do more of a survey review, this is actually a very high effect, because changing formalization rates is very, very hard. So this is actually the one study that we can find that had the highest impact on formalization rates in the Global South. So it is not a small effect. Access to state services, registration to the proximity test, the CISBEN score increased in 4 percentage points, 40 percentage points. Financial service access increased in 64 percentage points. But what is dramatic, and that which we were all shocked by, was the changes in primary outcomes. Consumption per capita increased in 60% for these outcomes, when this is in the middle of COVID. Income per capita also increased in 31%. And physical and mental health increased in 2 standard deviations. For the secondary outcomes, we have very noisy estimates. So we actually created indexes of many outcomes and tried to reduce the noise we had around them, but we were not able to distinguish robust effects across the different methodologies. We only found them for the OLS estimates. But we found there better labor conditions, less food insecurity, higher feelings of integration, and better COVID-19 resilience. But of course, that, again, is not as robust as the other results. So I don't want to bore you with tables. I'm just going to show you a couple of them, I promise. But I wanted just to kind of show you a little bit of the flavor of what we illustrate in the paper. So in this panel, you have the regression discontinuity estimates, and the panel B are just the means comparison, or the OLS regression that controls for observables. What you see is that for formal job, the probability of having a formal job, we observe changes of approximately 10 percentage points. It is not significant for the RDD, but I want you to notice something. The coefficients are very similar for both panels for formalization, suggesting there are no concerns in terms of biases driving the changes on these coefficients, but only loss in precision when you do the RDD. For the others, the results are robust across methodologies. The increment in CISBEN access, the proximity test to target safety nets, and the access on financial products. In terms of our primary outcomes, changes in the log of consumption per capita that are around 60%, changes in income of around 30%, and changes in the welfare index that we created that shows improvements in physical and mental health for refugees. So we also did an heterogeneous analysis, and we actually stratified our sample by education, gender, and city. So we could actually carry this evaluation. And so basically what we find is that the effects are not surprisingly stronger for highly educated individuals and for those who are in large urban centers like Bogota, Medellin, Barranquilla. For the gender results, I thought that was very interesting. We find that women use this program to have a higher access to social safety nets relative to men, but they actually reduce their labor force participation relative to men when they have access to this program. And so we talk in the qualitative surveys, we ask them about these results, and they mention that it could be driven, but this is of course qualitative evidence, by the fact that women might have decided to leave the labor market because now one member of the household has a better job. So they can do other things and take care of children, for example. And before I conclude, I wanted to show you some testimonies of what we found in the qualitative surveys. And this is because it was truly impactful for us to understand that this type of regularizations not only impact labor outcomes, as sometimes is simplified in the literature. So this is a testimony from an irregular worker in Medellin. And he says, he would wake up at 5 a.m. and at 5:30, we were in the mountains. At 7 p.m., when it was already dark, we were just finishing, covered in mud and wet, because even if it rained, we did not stop. That was the hardest part of this story. Being without a document is very hard. You always lose. So he's just, when he was saying this, he was just trying to signal how oftentimes when you don't have a document, employers abuse the conditions that they offer. And so he was probably signaling how unfair he thought the conditions in his job were. There is another testimony here of the person who is in the back. He was someone that was highly educated, a Venezuelan, that speak very well English, and he was trying to open a firm, but he could not do it. And so he was telling us, we have tried to get a language academy started, but many doors have closed on us because we are Venezuelan. Many people have told us they are not willing to hire Venezuelans. So he actually got the PEP, and he was able to open a firm in Colombia. And this one is from a woman, which was also very powerful, who got the PEP. And then she says, there is a change because when the police stops me and they ask me, you are Venezuelan, do you have a PEP? When I show them my PEP, their attitude changes. I mean, their face changes in the sense that they say, you're legal, you can go. And so this is just to signal how this program, having this document, is not only about a labor market or a job permit, is also a change in their mental health, in how they feel like they have warranties to have, let's say, guarantees to their human rights. So I think that was also a very powerful testimony. So let me conclude and trying to give you the big message that I think this paper allows us to give, which is the PEP was a powerful instrument to increase access to safety nets and financial services. It created large effects on labor formalization. But most importantly, and this is number 3, the bullet here in the slide, it improved consumption, income, and well-being. And these effects are huge. So we actually document changes of 60% in consumption per capita. So anyone who does research knows how big this is. But just to give you a comparison, a baseline to compare this, the increments of CCTs, like how much consumption changes when you actually just give money to people, unconditional CCTs, conditional CTs, unconditional cash transfers, I meant, in Colombia, Mexico, and Indonesia range between 0 and 15%. So this is almost 4 times that effect. So what we're saying is, if you just let people work, the impact is to the order of 4 times as big as giving them the money. So just to signal how important it is to allow people to have self-reliance and create their own way. And if you couple these results with the results of our earlier paper, in which we document negligible effects for the Colombian labor workers, this is a very powerful message on the strong case and virtues of formalization, at least for the case of Colombia. So the last one is our survey continues. we are finishing the second wave of this BENREP study, and we are looking forward to collecting a third one that is going to be focused on children. So looking forward to presenting how actually the life of these people has evolved in time and how life outcomes have changed for them. So thank you very much. I just wanted to acknowledge that before I close that the funding from this project was provided by multiple multilateral organizations, the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, and my previous employer, the University of Southern California. And the data for this paper was collected by IPA, Colombia. Thank you very much for your attention and the time spent here.
Thank you, Sandra. Fascinating. Felipe, let's turn it over to you. And let me just remind people, if you have questions, please put them in the chat or just let me know in the chat that you have a question and I'll call on you after we hear from Felipe. Felipe, over to you.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Dion and Ryan and Sandra for inviting me to this policy research talk at the World Bank. As Dion have mentioned before, my name is Felipe Munoz. I'm since August 2020 the Migration Unit Chief. And I was invited to give here a few short comments on the work of Sandra and very prominent group of authors on the effects of this massive regularization process, Venezuelan migrants in Colombia in 2018. Let me start with a personal note. As you have heard before, I was in 2018 the advisor of the President of Colombia for the migration crisis with Venezuela. And I was the one who led this migration amnesty process that is being analyzed. And I mention this because I want to highlight the importance of this type of analysis for public policy and how its results have served as a framework for the analysis of other subsequent regularization process, both in Colombia and for other similar studies in other countries that we are carrying out at the IDB, to which I refer later. In addition, having known the process, I'm unclear about the difficulties in obtaining, ordering, and processing the data for this research. One point worth explaining is that we in the government designed the process. We knew that the registration of irregular migrants that we were going to do would surely end up granting them some regular status in the country. But the people were not informed of that. This situation adds an interesting level of analysis as the incentives to register were not so clear to people. And we have to deal with, of course, with the initial distrust of many of the migrants to approach the registry. Another comment on the design of the process that can be useful for further academic studies, at least as far as Venezuelan migration in Latin America is concerned, is the discussion regarding the pull factors of the culling effect. So many people warned us in the government that offering a registry could affect migratory flows and that we would have an avalanche of migrants. The truth, in my experience after 3 years dealing in the government with this topic, is that neither this registry nor any of the other regularization process have significantly affected the flows. The flows of information within the migrants, they handle it in a very different way for what the one believes in government can transmit, and the decisions to migrate had almost nothing to do with announcements that the government of the receiving country could make. This is a personal note, this is my experience, but I think it's useful for so many other regularization processes that are now happening in Latin America and the Caribbean. Just a quick note to update the figures that Sandra has mentioned. Up to January 2022, there were 6 million Venezuelans that have fled their country in the last 5 years. This is 20% of their population, and 80% of them are located in Latin America and the Caribbean, transforming this migration in the second largest migratory crisis in the world these days, just following the Syria's one. This research topic will be relevant for Latin America and the Caribbean for many years to come. Some very brief comments on the work presented by Sandra. Initially, some issues on intrinsic value of the study, some other about the time value of the analysis, and finally, some ideas for future research. On the intrinsic value of the study, I want to reiterate the novelty. As she mentioned, but it's the word reiterating, is that examples of analysis of these types of regularizations are scarce in the world, and more so in Latin America and in the Caribbean, which is interesting from an academic point of view and becomes more important when we experience in the region this recent phenomena of intra-regional migration. But moreover, it is novel because many of the studies that have been carried out deal with the benefits when people obtain refugee status. What is different and relevant here from my point of view is that this is an ad hoc regularization mechanism, as were many others than countries in the region had adopted to deal with this situation. This is not exactly the same process that the refugee status like process. And this is interesting because in the region have experienced like an ad hoc process of legal ways to regularize the migrant. Moreover, the normal or the traditional refugee status process. I think second, we need to reiterate the value for the dimension. I want to emphasize that the possibility of doing experiments with population of more than 400,000 who register in the census and almost 300,000 who receive the regularization process is a challenging volume of information, but at the same time, it allows a depth analysis and evaluation of heterogeneous effect in different in Colombia. But also it was creative, as all of you can imagine, in creating the design of the samples. It cleverly and resourcefully regenerate a census of irregular migrants, which is not so easy because this is also a hidden population. So the representative samples of regular and irregular migrants were comparable, and it provides a better framework for the analysis. Another aspect is the analysis of the effects on migrants. Several of the studies that I have checked in the literature on topics of migrants refer to effects on natives. I think this is another line of research following by so many other studies that are not devoted just for migrants, but therefore, for natives, more for migrants, which is interesting. Another aspect with I want just to also to reiterate or to highlight is the comprehensiveness of the effects. As you have known, the literature deals in several studies with the effects primarily in the labor markets, labor displacement, effects on wage, but less so on the other aspects, such as mental health, access to government services, or integration in society, as they call secondary outcomes. I think it could be an area for further research, very worthy. Finally, in this part, combining a qualitative study with a quantitative study helped to define even reasons why a significant percentage of people who were registered in the census never came close to completing the process, which open up future research topics and provide clues for subsequent regularization policy exercise. Regarding the temporal value of the analysis, it is important to highlight that having constructed the control and treatment sample, it has been possible to continue doing subsequent rounds of evaluation, and thus not only to analyze the long-term temporal effects, but also to capture issues of differential effects. For example, with respect to COVID, which was subsequent to the first rounds of the study. In the future, it may also be possible to include beneficiary of other longer-term regularization schemes in Colombia, such as the temporary protection status for Venezuelan migrants, and in that way, just to compare if there are important difference between any of these regularization schemes. Regarding some areas for future work on the same study, regarding some areas of future work of the same study of the use of methodological framework to be applied in other similar cases, it's worth mentioning that this study has served as an example for others that we are conducted in other countries. Along with the massive migratory process, there are several regularization processes underway in Latin America and the Caribbean. We are analyzing data and information from processes in Dominican Republic, in Trinidad and Tobago, in Chile, and hopefully soon in Ecuador. In this way, the results of this work can be compared in a broader study with similar processes in other countries to find common points of difference. It may even be useful to review whether these cases in the Latin American and the Caribbean region are different from some of the literature in other regions of the world. Another topic that can be explored in greater detail in the future is the reason why people who begin the regularization process do not complete it. Some results from the qualitative part of the study mention some of them, for example, as fear of the migratory authority of information asymmetries. But what is very interesting is that the phenomenon that I will call losses during the process occurring as well in Chile with migrants. Some part of the migrants did not renew their permits, or in Peru, where many who have right to permanence document do not claim it, or in Colombia, where many people who have gone through all the process do not finish the process and do not claim the regularization document. Even more complex, in a conversation that I had with the head of the migratory authority in Colombia, now that they are dealing with the temporary status of protection that is given 10 years of regularization, and some who have started the process then do not come forward to claim the document. This is a challenge for the government of the region. It opens the analysis to broader areas not related to legal bottlenecks and more related to behavioral preconditions. Sandra mentioned some people that have not registered even have the right to do so, and give us some clues, but it's equally interesting in analyzing why you had already registered didn't complete the process. One last thing I would like to mention about the results is the possibility of exploring the gender component in more detail. There are some results that suggest that women are closer to the support networks, but less likely to benefit from the labor market. Though explaining the men take the jobs, it would be worthwhile to explore the analysis in more depth. Let me end with a few more comments for discussion. The longer migrants in Latin America stay in the host countries, the more necessary the integration process becomes. Some recent surveys we have applying the IDB to Venezuelan migrants in Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador show us that more than 70% of them say that they don't have intention of returning to the country in the next 5 years. This is indicative that this is a medium-term development challenge, and proper integration is the turning point in turning into an opportunity. This is why rigorously studying the effects of regularization is so valuable for the region. In the case of Colombia, migrants were relatively evenly distributed throughout the country. So it will be interesting to check the data if we can find more clues if there are any heterogeneous effects depending on the location of people in places closest to the border compared to other places. It could be very useful in terms of differentiation public policy region. And my last idea is that it's not a secret that xenophobic sentiments are on the rise, and the effects of establishing real information on the benefit for migrants and the non-affectation for natives become a necessary public policy instrument. And this is where studies such as this one and others to come will be most useful. As we have seen in some preliminary results in our Migration Perception Lab, a generalized phenomenon in the region is the worsening of the public perception regarding migrants. The most recurrent idea, as it is in other parts of the world, is that migrants take jobs away from natives or commit more crimes, to name a few. The evidence shows that this is not true, but we must communicate it better, more efficiently, and with clear examples. Finally, with all these few ideas, I want just to incentivize the debate and mention that there is still a great deal of room for further research on these issues, on the effects and benefits of migration in the region, and that both the IDB and the World Bank have a role to play in it. Therefore, I'm really grateful, Dion, for this opportunity and this invitation, and will be here if there are any further comment or questions. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. That's thank you for those insights, reflections, and suggestions. And also, I want to acknowledge the collaboration here between the institutions, both on the analytical part of this work, but also your presence here, which I think is great. Before turning it to the Q&A, I mean, Sandra, do you have any initial reactions to these comments?
No, just incredibly grateful, Felipe, for all your collaboration through our studies. And also, I think one thing that I really probably didn't say in my talk and you mentioned here, I think this is an important thing for everyone to get after or remember after we finish this talk, is that there is an important feeling of that is manifested by the refugees that they are not going back. A lot of them are not going back. So it makes this type of initiative the most important. These populations seem to be willing to stay or thinking of staying in this country. So how are we going to help them in a development approach or based framework so that they can become self-reliant? Which is something that struck me very, very, very dramatically from your comments, Felipe. Thank you.
Great. So we have a couple of people who've put some questions. We have Carolina. Do you want to, can you unmute and ask your question?
So I am reading her comment here, and so she was asking about whether we know anything about the crime impacts or how the victimization changed for the beneficiaries of this program. So we do have another study with Ana Maria Ibañez and Dani Bahar, in which we're examining the impacts of this amnesty on crime reports. And we see that that actually there was not an increment in crime or a reduction in crime per se overall in the country, but we do see that Venezuelan reports have increased because of this amnesty, and especially the ones coming from women concerning domestic abuse. So this is actually highlighting how important it is for them to have some, let's say, guarantee that they can actually come to the light and say that there are violations going on through their human rights. So that's what we have been able to document so far.
Let me down, if you allow me just to jump in, just to add that, yes, we are studying now that the effects of these migratory flows and crime. And we have some examples in Trinidad and Tobago, Colombia, Peru, and Chile, and we haven't found yet. And we review, of course, check and other studies, any particular increase in the crime. Of course, in the, as we call the economic crimes, and sometimes and in some specific parts, there is a little increase. But in general terms, it's not true that the migratory increase the crime. What we need just to show and to improve is our capacity to communicate to people this kind of perceptions, is what I called before about the perception on the xenophobic sentiments.
Thanks. We have a question from Fabricio Zanzi. Do you mind unmuting and asking your question? I guess people are being shy today. They're willing to write their questions and not willing to say them. I mean, I guess, so I guess he's saying in Ecuador, we found a big problem in the Venezuelan social integration. This is the problem. Corruption in Venezuela to get academic documents from their university titles or grades. It's very expensive to get certification. And without university titles, it's very difficult to find a job in the host country. Do you think there would be a role for the creation of an international organization to certify knowledge of Venezuelan people? That's a tricky and a very specific question. I'm not sure you have an opinion on that, but I don't know if you see this sort of issue of qualifications and certifications.
We do. Yeah, so we found that this program had a very important effect, but what we also were able to document in our qualitative surveys is that for many of the people who are actually beneficiaries of the program, they were able to improve their labor market conditions. Some of them didn't jump to the formal sector, but they have better labor conditions in the informal sector. But the reason that is preventing that many, or at least the ones that we interviewed in the qualitative surveys, were not jumping to the formal sector is that in many cases they did not have their titles validated, exactly what is happening in Ecuador. And so I totally could see how interventions that try to also address those bottlenecks could be very good for these populations. Yes, I think that's a very relevant topic.
And then we have a question from Oyebola. Would you like to unmute and just ask a question? Yay.
Thank you so much, Sandra and Felipe, for great comments and great presentation. I was wondering about the decision that the government made when it was doing the census to not let people know that this would have implications for their regularization. And from Felipe's comments, it seemed like there was a bit of a surprise that not more people took up So I just wonder if people knew that, oh, if I go and register, then I would be eligible to maybe get regularized. Would that have increased the take-up rates? Because I just imagine if I'm irregular in a country and they say come and register, my first thought is they want to round us up and send us back. So I probably would not. And so I'm just wondering. And second kind of related question is whether there are like future chances if you miss that first entry point, could you then join in the future?
Yeah, thank you, Yobola. Thank you for being here, your interest in our work. So I, of course, will let Felipe answer because he was in the government. But from what we were able to understand in our research, when this was advertised, the census, this was not advertised as a census that will help you get access to a regularization program. This was just a census to count the number of irregular migrants in Colombia. Of course, there could be expectations. No, that's something that we can't really say anything about what they were thinking was going to happen. For sure, there was a trust issue, so there is selection in who came to the light and registered, but the government worked with local organizations and they actually tried to create a trust with the local communities and signaled this was just a statistical analysis to try to direct these resources where there were more migrants. And then later the president, after this close, decided, oh, you know what, anyone who's registered is going to be have the opportunity. But of course, Felipe, you were there living it, so you probably can explain more than I did.
No, I think it was a hard decision if we communicate, but the decision at final was not communicated, just to inform the people that it's just accounting, a census, just to helping the government to know where are the migrants, because it's not only that you register, you feel like a very long questionnaire survey with more than 30 questions, and in that way we can find some other information. I'm not sure if we are announced, there are so many more people. I'm not sure, and as I mentioned, I don't believe more in the calling effects, because the numbers that Migración Colombia have calculated at that time for the irregular migrants in the country is around 500,000. And the people have approached the census were almost 500,000. Then there is no like a very ample difference in the numbers that we assume that are for the irregular migrants of the people that really go. What is more striking for me is that after you register, you don't finalize the process, which is because we announced that, okay, you have the right and only 300,000 people go, oh, no, not only, it's a big number, but 100,000 didn't finalize the process, which is more interesting, as is what I mentioned that is happening now in Chile, in Peru, also in Colombia. We have a gap of information, in asymmetries of information, or maybe another type of behavioral incentive that the government have to put in place, because the announcement is not enough just to incentivize the people that finalize really the process. This is one idea that maybe I want to share with you, Ojabola. Thank you.
Thanks. In a second, I'm going to turn it to Berk, who signaled that he had a question or two or reaction. But we did get a question from Hannah Sue on YouTube, which it's a very broad question, but actually I'm curious to get your reaction to it, which is, what are the limitations of the study? So where do you think, what are the questions that remain after you've done this empirical analysis that what do you feel more confident about, and maybe what is less confident and that you might be able to address in subsequent rounds? But before you answer that, let me turn to Berk if you want to add a couple of reactions, and then you can deal with those together.
Oh, thanks. Thank you both, Felipe and Sandra, for the talk and the comments. I was interested in that quote from that strong woman in Barranquilla, right? That actually worried me, because that said to me that the program might have made the illegals like more vulnerable, because if they're saying you're legal, you're good, that means they're saying you're illegal, you're no good. So unless the police were treating everybody really badly beforehand, what could have the government done kind of like to design this program a bit better so that those vulnerable people who didn't finish the last mile kind of like aren't treated even, they become kind of like this stigmatized group now because they didn't register for PEP. And then a small, just tiny bit of caution on the interpretation. You compared them to CCTs and UCTs. But I worry that that's a bit of apples and oranges, because in all those programs, people are already eligible for work. It's just they're getting money. Here you have both of those things. So you don't have the experiment where if you gave these people money, maybe their consumption would have gone up 50%. We don't really know. So just a maybe tiny bit of caution on the comparisons there. But thanks so much. This is great.
So I'm going to pile on my question because I actually had a similar reaction to Beric's to that point. But there's a statistical implication of that, which is for the RDD, if you have sort of a negative effect on the right-hand side and a positive effect on the left-hand side, you may be picking that up, right, in the statistical analysis and overstating the benefits because you're not taking into account the potential negative effect.
Yes, thank you. All great comments. And of course, they wouldn't reach a lot of our papers. So from what I hear, there was not that, of course, this was based on the qualitative survey that we had with this woman, and we have not done a study specifically on that. But we do not have any evidence to say that this program resulted in more discrimination towards illegal migrants or irregular migrants in Colombia. I think there has been, like, this discrimination has been there in, like, towards those migrants specifically. Well, to say Colombia is a generous country and more than any other country has been open, but still the authorities may be discriminating between individuals who do not have a regular document. But there's not, like, evidence for me to statistically observe that there has been a decline in the conditions. But we could do one thing we could do, we have not done, is check retrospectively at feelings of discrimination for the control group. No, like, we're currently doing a survey, so we can actually ask them, do you feel that after these programs were enacted and you do not have this program, do you feel that there's more discrimination towards you? And this is something we can actually ask. But I don't have a feeling that this is actually the case, but again, which is something we could definitely check for the future. And another thing, on related note of what could be improved, or the things that I think are future topics for research, is that in the sample that on the YouTube question that we received, is that in our sample we only observed people who had not leave Colombia, and so we could not find, of course, because we interviewed these people in 2020, 2 years after the program was enacted, we could not observe migrants who left. And so in that sense, our results are conditional to that population, the population to actually stay in Colombia. So it would be interesting to know, for example, if someone applied for the program and still decide to move to other countries, why that happened and what happened to those. Are they better off, or could they be better off by having stayed in Colombia? So that's a very difficult part of migration research, which is how do you actually track these people, and a challenge for, of course, design for these studies. So thank you for the comments.
Thanks, Sandra. Felipe, do you want to comment on this, the potential sort of negative spillover effects on non-regularized migrants?
No, I agree with what Sandra has said. Just let me put this in perspective, because after this regularization process, there are other regularization processes that are coming every 6 months. And now the temporary protection status. Then now it's supposedly that there is no regular migrants. Of course, the people that have who entry 2021 to now, when the government announced the temporary protection status. And I think it would be interesting that it happens. But the idea of the government of Colombia is that to regularize all the migrants that are residing in the country. Then I don't feel, but I don't have, of course, the research, but in my experience, I don't have any a specific situation, because this is not illegal to be an irregular migrant in Colombia. This is an administrative process, but it's not yet that you go to jail to be illegal in migrant. It's not a topic of illegal. It's more an irregular administrative thing.
Thanks, Felipe. I think this relates to a question Roni put in the chat. Roni, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah. Hi, Sandra and Felipe. Can you hear me? Yeah, I believe so. Thank you for the presentation. Actually, it touched my heart because of Venezuelan and Nicaraguan situation, to be honest. And I was wondering about, there's a new permit, if I'm correct, it's the PEPFF for the formalization of those irregular migrants that could be related to Berg's point as well about those sentiments that those irregular migrants could have. Do you have any information about those new permits in your sample and whether this also could be integrated into those analysis that you have done? And my second question, if I could add also, do you have any information about the sentiments of Colombians where you took, you had that survey? Because there was a strong message before, like 2019, 2020, that it was like around 30% of people in Colombia that they felt that Venezuelan migrants were like pushing wages down, and that actually went up, like up to 60 to 80% in recent surveys. So do you have any information about whether having PEP, for example, could also diminish that sentiment or could also actually increase that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let me answer your last question first, and then I'll talk about the PPT, which is the new permit that the government enacted. And of course, Felipe, jump in when you think that I am misrepresenting, or that, of course, you would like to complement my response. So there is a recent study that I am working on right now, which we're trying to see how this amnesty has impacted voting behaviors. And we have found negligible effects. So again, this is not the impact of migration per se, like how migration impacts voting behaviors or perceptions of altruism for social views, but more how this regularization, once the Venezuelans are there in Colombia and you allow them to be part of the formal sector, give them the regularization, does that change voting behaviors or pro-social behaviors, social capital for Colombian natives? We find no effects, no known effects. I was not surprised because people are not as informed in Colombia about the number of people who are regularized or that this program was enacted. They are more informed about the inflows, the overall inflows of migrants. So we don't find any changes there. On your first question, yes, the Colombian government has enacted a regularization that is even larger. Beginning this year, anyone who arrived before January 2021 could apply to a more generous amnesty of up to 10 years. And so we like to think, Felipe, of course, can talk about this, that our study helped inform that policy decision. But of course, we're working with the government to see how the results that we are producing with the new waves can inform that process. The current survey that we are collecting, however, was collected before or during this program was announced, so we don't have data there as to, well, we have data on their intentions to regularize, but not of whether they have done it, because the program has not closed, the regularization window has not closed for those individuals. But what we plan to do is compare how having a window of regularization of 2 years versus 10 years changes the decisions of migrants, because now they have a longer term of, let's say, regular status in Colombia. And so that's the plan again for our future studies. We are also conducting experiments to try to see how we can increase take-up of this program, of the new regularization program in rural areas in Colombia. Like, can we give them more information, and information targeted to what? To increasing trust, to giving details about the program, to creating empathy towards who's actually giving the information, other Venezuelan migrant that has formalized. And this is currently in the field, so we will have more information on that later.
Oh, thank you, Ronnie. Just to add 2 ideas, we have a laboratory of perception of migrants, and we are carrying out several studies in the region. And there is a general phenomenon of the deterioration of the public opinion regarding migrants. In the specific case of Colombia, yes, there is a deterioration, but it is not exactly linked with the regularization announcement. When you analyze the social media, even the structural data, it affects a lot more. For example, an announcement when some newspapers say there is a crime and it's committed by a Venezuelan. The crime things affect a lot more like the public perception and the changes in the conversation and the social media regarding migration. We don't find any specific correlation between the announcement of the regularization with the deterioration of the public perception. The deterioration is 3 years, it comes from 2 years ago, but it's general in the region, and maybe it's more associated with other topics, which is interesting because it's as we mentioned before, I don't believe a lot in the culling effect, for example, in these specific cases, and not that this is really the cause of the deterioration in the public perception. But this is a place that the governments have to work a lot, because there is a very complex perception situation in the region regarding migrants.
Thanks. So just to let you know, Ryan has put a link to the paper in the chat in case people want to follow up with the paper. And then we have a participant, Domenico Tabassa, who's given us a link to a set of papers from a recent JDC research conference on forced displacement. So I'm sure those interested can follow up there. We'll also have a newsletter. We have a departmental newsletter that'll go out that summarizes this research along with other research coming out of the research department on migration. Ryan has also put the link where we'll sort of put all the event materials. And then just you participants here might be interested to know that this is very related to the topic of the 2023 World Development Report that Sandra is a team member of, on forget the exact title right now. Sandra, what's the title? It's basically around forced displacement, but
correct. It's going to be on migration across borders. So the exact title we're defining, but this is the core topic of the WDR. And so, of course, stay tuned. There is a lot that we're working very hard as a team to communicate.
So there'll be a lot of communications around that going forward. So stay tuned to that. So with that, I want to thank everybody for your participation, for the great interesting questions, for the great presentation. And Felipe, thanks for joining us. Really insightful comments, both as a practitioner and now in your new position, sort of reflecting more broadly. It's been really fascinating for me. So thank you, everybody, and stay tuned for the more on this topic. And then in about a month's time, we'll have another policy research talk on a different topic. So please feel free to join us then as well. Okay, thanks
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you a lot, Dion. Bye, Sandra.
Bye. Thank you, Felipe.
Bye.
Thank you, Dion. Bye.